The Andersons huddled in the living room, their eyes anxiously glued to the television screen, where a weather report was in progress. Mr. Anderson, a tall man with a kind face, nervously asked his wife, "Honey, do you think we should head down to the basement? They're saying the tornado might hit Greenfield." Mrs. Anderson, a caring and strong-willed woman, nodded in agreement. "Yes, I think it's best if we take precautions. Let me grab some blankets and pillows for Jack, and you gather the emergency supplies." As they quickly gathered their essentials, little did they know that their loyal companion, Hugo, was observing them intently. His ears perked up as he sensed their worry and knew that something serious was happening. Hugo had always been attuned to the emotions of his human family, and in that moment he could feel their fear and knew he had to protect them. Once the Andersons had gathered their supplies, they made their way to the basement, calling for Hugo to follow. But Hugo stayed rooted to the spot, staring back at them with a determined look in his eyes. "Come on, Hugo," Mrs. Anderson called again, but the dog didn't budge. Instead, Hugo let out a soft whine, as if trying to tell them something. Mr. Anderson noticed the hesitation and said, "Wait, maybe Hugo senses something we don't. He's always been protective of Jack. I think he wants to make sure the baby is safe." Mrs. Anderson looked at Hugo with newfound understanding. "You're right. Let's split up. You take Jack to the basement, and I'll stay here with Hugo. If there's any sign of danger, we'll join you immediately." With a heavy heart, Mr. Anderson carried Jack to the basement, while Mrs. Anderson stayed by Hugo's side. The winds outside intensified, and the distant sound of the tornado grew louder. Hugo gazed up at Mrs. Anderson, then towards the stairs, as if trying to communicate his intentions. "Hugo, what are you thinking?" Mrs. Anderson asked, stroking his fur gently. But before she could say anything more, Hugo darted upstairs with surprising speed. Alarmed, Mrs. Anderson called after him, but Hugo didn't look back. He knew he had to reach Jack and keep him safe, no matter the risks. As the tornado loomed closer, Mrs. Anderson's worry intensified, but she also had faith in Hugo's instincts. She held her breath and prayed for their safety, trusting that Hugo would do whatever it took to protect their baby boy from the impending disaster. With adrenaline pumping through his veins, Hugo raced upstairs, his paws pounding against the wooden steps. The wind howled outside, shaking the house with increasing intensity. He reached Jack's room and found the baby soundly sleeping in his crib, oblivious to the impending danger. With gentle nudges, Hugo tried to wake Jack, but the baby remained peacefully asleep. Realizing that there was no time to waste, Hugo picked Jack's hoodie up in his mouth, being ever so careful not to harm the little one. He cradled him securely, just as he had seen Mrs. Anderson do countless times. With Jack safely in his grasp, Hugo faced the growing storm with determination in his eyes. The winds tugged at his fur and threatened to sweep him away, but Hugo clung to the ground, determined to get his precious cargo to safety. Step by step, Hugo carefully descended the stairs, his heart racing with each passing moment. The howling winds seemed to grow louder, and debris from outside began to fly past the windows. Hugo knew he had to hurry. Finally, with great effort, Hugo emerged into the basement, where the Andersons were anxiously waiting. Mrs. Anderson gasped when she saw Hugo carrying Jack in his mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes as she rushed to take the baby from Hugo's embrace. "Oh, Hugo, you brave, brave boy!" she exclaimed, hugging the dog tightly. Mr. Anderson joined in, grateful for their loyal companion's heroic act. As the family huddled together in the basement, the tornado unleashed its fury upon Greenfield. The winds raged outside, tearing branches from trees and flinging loose objects through the air. But inside the basement, the Andersons felt safe, knowing they had their protector, Hugo, by their side. Eventually, the Andersons carefully emerged from the basement, their home showing signs of damage, but they were grateful that everyone was unharmed.